The year was 1940 when Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, he was awakened in the middle of the night by a phone call. It's never good when the phone rings in the middle of the night. The leader of France was calling to tell him some really unfortunate news. So this is in the middle of World War II, and the German Nazis had broken through the Ardennes forest, which was in between France and Germany. And they had completely miscalculated the route that the Germans were going to take. He said, this is not good. We've got to get our troops out immediately. But the only problem is there was only one way to get the troops out, and that was to cross the English Channel, which is notorious for its choppy waters. It's a turbulent body of water. And it was to take the troops through a city called Dunkirk. Maybe you watched the movie a couple of years ago when it came out in theaters. It was such a cool movie. Churchill didn't like this Dunkirk escape route from the start. It felt like kind of a suicide mission to him. He thought maybe at best they'd be able to get 10% of their troops home. So we're talking over 300,000 men needed to be rescued from the Allied forces and brought back to safety to get out of the way of the Germans who were encroaching. And he hoped maybe 30,000 would be able to return by crossing the English Channel. Does this sound a bit familiar? A little bit like the Israelites when the Egyptian forces are coming closer and they don't know a way out. They are backed up against the Red Sea and they're like, God, what are we going to do? This looks impossible. This looks like the end. Now, what happened next is something miraculous, literally miraculous. Nobody saw this coming. The next morning, King George VI took to the airwaves and he called for a national day of prayer for the nation of England. He literally said these words, "Let us with one heart and soul, humbly but confidently commit our cause to God and ask his aid." The next day, 800 civilian sailors kind of felt the call to, I'm going to get up, I'm going to take my little fisherman's boat, and I'm going to line it up across the English Channel. I'm going to be part of this rescue mission to bring the troops home. Meanwhile, thousands of British people, we have a photo of it, lined the streets, uniting in a day of prayer, somberly waiting for God to do a miracle. So this is, that's the scene. That's an actual photo of this National Day of Prayer. They're just pleading for God for a miracle because they know far well that these troops that we have in another photo, they may likely never make it home. But as these little sailors and their boats, they're heading out, these fishermen, none of them are armed. A few of them are trained for the choppy waters of the English Channel. And only a few of them, it's recorded, had compasses to even point them in the right direction. They were at extreme threat of aerial attack. They're just out in this open body of water. And then something unforecasted happened. A turbulent storm rolled in. A storm so bad that the German planes had to be grounded. Meanwhile, the German tanks, which are on the ground, they are only 10 miles away from the beaches of Dunkirk. Like they could have been to the troops, within minutes. When the storms got so bad that Hitler did the unthinkable and he halted his troops. This is real. This actually happened. He halted his troops. Historians to this day cannot explain why he made this move. Most call it one of the biggest tactile errors in war ever to be recorded. So for 3 days, the Nazis do not advance. They hold steady, waiting for the call to be released and move forward. And for 3 days, I find it no coincidence, the nation of Great Britain has their hands clasped in intercessory prayer, pleading with God for a miracle to deliver these troops. What happens during those 3 days is trip by trip, boat by boat, the Allied forces are loaded in to these little sailboats and fishermen boats. We have a photo of it here. And they are taken back to safety. It's recorded that the English Channel's usually brutal waves during this storm were completely calm. The cloud cover was so thick that most of this entire operation was completely undetected by the Germans. So imagine their surprise when the storm rolls away, the clouds lift, and 338,000 Allied troops are returned home safely. Winston Churchill, a non-religious man, even acknowledged the hand of God, calling this event a miracle of deliverance. And this event has since become known in the history books. It is recorded not as what happened at Dunkirk. It is literally called the miracle of Dunkirk. Today we're looking at another battle in the scriptures that was won by the very same weapon of intercessory prayer. Now, to intercede, maybe you've heard that word before, that type of prayer. It simply means to lift a request up to God on behalf of someone or something else, to bring it before God in prayer. So to catch you up to speed, we've been journeying through the book of Exodus. We've seen that the nation of Israel has been enslaved under Pharaoh's rule for over 400 years in captivity. God performs miracle after miracle until finally he parts the Red Sea. He delivers them out of slavery and into freedom. We saw last week that as they're following their leader Moses through the desert, even though it's really fresh that they've arrived into this freedom and this huge miracle of deliverance, they begin grumbling and complaining. They don't like the water that they have to drink. They liked the food better in their Egyptian prison. They're saying, God, we want to go back. Why did you even bring us out here? But God, in his graciousness, he performs more miracles, giving them water that's suitable to drink and manna from heaven, good food for them to be able to eat. As they're continuing on, trekking along through the desert wilderness in their quest towards Canaan, the promised land. So this is where we pick up today. If you have a Bible with you, go ahead and open it to the book of Exodus. If you don't have a Bible, we have free orange ones available for you in the seats, under the seats in front of you. And if you don't have a Bible at home, you're welcome to take those home. They're free, they're for you. We're gonna be on page 50 this morning. So I'll be reading from Exodus chapter 17, and we're gonna be starting in verse 8. The Amalekites came and attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua, choose some of our men and go and fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands. So Joshua fought the Amalekites as Moses had ordered, and Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill. As long as Moses held his hands up, the Israelites were winning. But whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. When Moses' hands grew tired, they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. Aaron and Hur held his hands up, one on one side and one on the other, so that his hands remained steady till sunset. So Joshua overcame the Amalekite army with the sword. And then the Lord said to Moses, write this on a scroll as something to be remembered, and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. Moses built an altar and called it, the Lord is my banner. He said, because hands were lifted up against the throne of the Lord will be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation. This seems to kind of come out of nowhere, this battle. We have no context, no warm up for it. But the battle of the Israelites and the Amalekites, this is actually the first recorded battle that we're seeing in the scriptures so far. And we're also introduced to this other main character, Joshua, without much of an introduction. Joshua is who is later going to take over Moses' leadership of the Israelites. So Moses kind of calls Joshua out of the bullpen, and he says, gather some strong men, head down to the battlefield. I'm going to go up to the top of the hill tomorrow. This battle is the first of another sort of test for the Israelites. We looked at last week how they were tested in the desert. This is a different type of test because what's going to mark Israel's conquest for the promised land is the threat of continual warfare. They are going to have to battle for the land of Canaan that they take and later battle against the Babylonians. So this appears to be the first battle that they engage in, but this isn't actually where the battle starts. The Amalekites, they are descendants of Amalek, and he is the grandson of Esau. Yes, this has taken lots of Googling to figure out how to pronounce these names. So I made this little chart. This is actually going to show us the origins of this battle. I find this absolutely mind-blowing because there's so much going on beyond what we read at face value. So the battle between the Israelites and the Amalekites, those two tribes descended from brothers. So the Israelites descend from Jacob, who's also known as Israel, and the Amalekites descend from Esau. These, Jacob and Esau, have an explosive sibling rivalry, if you remember reading about that earlier in the scriptures. But that sibling rivalry between the two brothers is also not the first sibling rivalry that we see in the scriptures. In Genesis, in the book of Genesis, there are two notable sibling rivalries between brothers as well. There's one between Isaac and Ishmael. And then the very first brothers, this is the offspring of Adam and Eve, between Cain and Abel. Now hang with me because this gets really interesting, I think. So Abel is considered righteous and Cain is considered evil. Why? It's because Cain lets envy overtake him and he ends up murdering his brother Abel. Here's what the author of 1 John attributes the actions of Cain to. I find this so interesting. He says, "Do not be like Cain, who belonged to the evil one and murdered his brother." And why did he murder him? Because his own actions were evil. His brother's actions were righteous. So do not be surprised, my brothers and sisters, if the world hates you. Okay, we can go back to that chart for a minute. Many biblical scholars would think that this line of tension, of opposition between, as you can see it going up all the way to the Israelites and the Amalekites, is actually a personification or a physical representation of the battle between God and Satan. This battle between God and Satan has been raging since the very dawn of creation, but these are the people or the tribes that we see it working out through. Now, it doesn't mean that, the Amalekites and Esau, Ishmael, and Cain, that they're actually Satan. That's not what that means. It's not like you can get in a fight with your brother and start calling him, the enemy or Satan. That's not what this means, but it means that any force that is actively opposing the people of God and God's redemption plan to restore the earth, which remember was coming through Israel, God's chosen people, anything that opposes that is a force of opposition, is a force of the enemy. So while this may be the first recorded battle we see, it's actually a battle that predates even this time. Goes back to the dawn of creation, the war between God and Satan, the war that is still going on, very much so today. This is a battle that cannot be fought with traditional warfare. As Paul tells us, this type of a battle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers and the principalities of the world, which is exactly why Moses chooses the position that he does to fight this battle. He knows that he has to engage a spiritual weapon for the Israelites to overcome the Amalekites. Let's look back at what he says. Moses says to Joshua, "Choose some of our men and go out to fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands." So Joshua went and he fought the Amalekites as Moses had ordered, and Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill. As long as Moses held his hands up, the Israelites were winning. But whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. And when Moses' hands grew tired, they took a stone, they put it under him, and he sat on it. Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on each side, one on the other, so that his hands remained steady until sunset. And Joshua overcame the Amalekite army with the sword. Literally with a sword, but figuratively with the sword of the Spirit. Here's a painting depicting that scene. So you can see that the position that Moses is in, he's up on top of the hill. He is very much engaged in a spiritual battle. And I love how you can look down and you can see there in the valley, the physical battle between flesh and blood is also being fought. So what's the deal with this staff and Moses raising his hands? It's not that there was magic in the staff. It's not that, Moses is playing kind of like Simon Says or Moses Says with God. Like, okay, I'm going to raise my hands up. Okay, God, let us win. I'm going to put my hands down. God backs off. That's not what's going on. Although from this angle, it does look like Moses might be getting a good arm workout. I don't know if that's more tricep or bicep focused, but nevertheless, that's not the point of the staff. We have seen that God's power is demonstrated through the staff many times up until this point in Exodus. But what's happening here Actually, if we look to the end of this passage, verse 16, it kind of clues us in. It says, because hands were lifted up against the throne of the Lord will be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation. Now, this doesn't say that the Amalekites had their hands lifted against Israel. Isn't that so interesting? They were really battling against the throne of God. So imagine it. They are putting like power and oppression of the enemy up against the throne of the Lord. Moses responds by lifting the staff of God as a symbolic way to exert God's power, God's rule, reign, and authority over the battle. Moses' staff is a physical symbol of him exalting God's power over the battle. In other words, he's saying, God, this battle belongs to you. Yahweh, have your way over this battlefield. God, let your kingdom come here and not the enemies. Our greatest weapon to fight spiritual battles is what Moses already knew to be true, and that is intercessory prayer. In this staff, while Moses has it lifted, it is an act of active intercession over the people of God. Saying, God, come through. God, this battle is in your hands. John Piper says that the number one reason why prayer malfunctions in the hands of believers is that they try to turn a wartime walkie-talkie into a domestic intercom. Until you believe that life is war, you cannot know what prayer is for. If you were here with us this past fall, we went through a series on spiritual warfare. It was honestly one of the most powerful things I think we've done as a church. And we shared this quote. If you're like me or younger, you have no idea what a domestic intercom is. But there was a house I lived in once where we had one and it didn't operate, but I made you a little slide with a photo of a domestic intercom. It's that one in the corner right there. Kind of the Ring camera could be a modern day equivalent of the domestic intercom because you can kind of ask like, who's there? What do you want? Although people I think only did that right when the Ring camera came out. Now they just ignore the rings altogether. But I'm pretty sure, correct me if I'm wrong, if you're older and wiser than me, that the domestic intercom was used just to talk from room to room or to say like, hey, it's dinner time, instead of having to shout it up the stairs like we do now. Domestic intercoms are casual. It's just a mechanism for convenience, an easy way to communicate between rooms. Now, in contrast, a wartime walkie-talkie, like that's a lifeline. That is critical. That is a way of communicating when you realize that you're in battle. You know you're in battle and you need help. Which one of those represents the way that you view prayer? I like that answer, Louis. That's a good answer. Many of us, in the words of John Piper, don't encounter or experience the power of intercessory prayer to its fullest extent because we treat it like a domestic intercom. It's there for casual convenience. When we have a few extra seconds, when we remember to pray, whatever it is, we treat prayer with such casualness. And it's not because we intend to. It's because most of us don't realize that we are in a battle against the unseen realm every single day. And when we realize that there is a spiritual war waged around us, we treat prayer differently. Now, I don't say that obviously to scare you, as much as I do just to awaken you to the reality that the scriptures testify to, that we are in the midst of a spiritual war. As Mark shared last week, Israel's story is our story. We too are spiritual pilgrims. We are marching towards our promised land of a new heaven and a new earth where we will see a full and complete defeat of evil marked by the full redemption and restoration of God's creation as he intended it. And while we are in the desert wilderness, which is what we call this period in between, we are surrounded by battles. We will have to fight battles, just like the Israelites are finding themselves in that position. One of the goals of this passage of Exodus 17 is to lift our eyes to the real enemy that we fight against daily. It is not against flesh and blood or people that annoy you or the opposite political party. It is really against Satan, the one who has opposed God from the dawn of creation, the one the Lord will be at war with, as this passage says, from generation to generation. Remember, the Amalekites here, they represent a larger enemy at work. And this battle is just a taste of the larger cosmic battle that is going on, the one that we find ourselves in today. But today the battle looks a little different. It is subtle. It is so subtle that if your eyes aren't open to it spiritually, you'll probably miss it. And that's part of the enemy's battle tactic. He doesn't want us to be awakened to his schemes, the small, subtle ways that he is waging war against God's people every day. Here are some of the ways that it may show up. It's in the self-centered words that we use with our spouse or our kids every day. It's in the fear that grips your mind when you think about the future. It's in the influences of bad, toxic relationships that you continue to stay in relationship with. It's maybe your avoidance of prayer or the corruption of simple, God-given pleasures. The battle is waged in many unexpected, barely perceptible ways. Now, of course, it can be in big and obvious things like catastrophic natural disasters or when we see a terrorist attack or some senseless act of violence. Oftentimes the only way that we can say, how does something like this even happen, is if we believe that there is an enemy at work. But on a practical level, scholar Peter Enns says, our battle is truly spiritual, and it occurs in the many situations we face every day that vie for our attention and attempt to make us less fit for heaven. The true nature of the battle is best seen in the quiet of our own hearts, where two powers are fighting for control. Barely perceptible, subtle. That's the first problem we face today when it comes to this battle, is we don't often recognize when we're in it. The second problem is that when we do recognize that we're in the midst of a battle, we have a hard time asking for help. We have a hard time asking for an Aaron and a Hur to come and lift our hands and help intercede for us before God to make it through whatever challenge or spiritual battle we're facing. Some of the things that I hear a lot when people will tell me, yeah, I just had like this horrible week. We're going through this horrible situation, but I didn't want to ask for prayer because I know someone probably has it worse off than I do. Someone's probably fighting a bigger battle. And yeah, that can be absolutely true. That is true a lot of the times. I'm sure at any given point, there is somebody fighting a bigger battle than you are. But don't let that be an excuse to not seek prayer for your own battle, because what that does is that gives the enemy an easy win in the small battle in comparison to what you're facing. By going that route, by not asking for prayer, by not interceding, what happens is we don't engage the main weapon that we've been given to fight. I was actually kind of in this predicament on Monday of this week. It was a day that was just kind of one thing after another. There were subtle things, distractions, family things. Mark woke up in a lot of pain. Eden randomly was just standing on a brand new rug we put down and just threw up her food. Like, she's not sick, there's no other symptoms, but if you have kids, you know, sometimes like that just happens. Like, what's going on? Parker got hurt at school. Like, my goal on Monday was to do all of my reading and research and prepare on this passage, to write a message on spiritual warfare and intercessory prayer. And obviously, I barely got to any of it. It was a day of low-grade chaos and distraction. And in the evening, before I was getting ready for bed, I realized, wait, this doesn't seem like a string of bad coincidences today. This is the pattern how the enemy often attacks me and my family. So I just posted a few simple words on Instagram, asking for prayer for my family. And I almost didn't post that because I was like, it's not like I have anything huge going on today. But then I was like, no, you know what? I should. I'm going to post it. I'm going to accept prayer. I'm going to recognize, hey, this is a battle. Even though it might be a small one in comparison, it's still a battle. And I don't want the enemy to win. So I'm going to ask for prayer. And then I did. And then I'm like, should I take that down? You know, I'm just telling you, honestly, this is what was going through my mind. But I didn't. Did you pray? Thanks, Louie. This is why I don't post, okay? Those of you saints in the room who did pray for me, thank you. We all have to start somewhere, Louie. Another reason that we don't ask for prayer is because we think someone is too busy to pray for us. We are all busy people. I've encountered that also a lot in this season of life. I'm like, why didn't you tell me? I could have been praying for you. And someone's like, oh, well, you have too much going on. You have like 3 kids now and, stuff and school. And yeah, I do. It is a busy season. We are all in a busy season. But I think of it as this. I'm going to be wiping bottoms and feeding mouths and running errands and folding laundry regardless. I might as well be interceding for you while I'm doing all of that. It's not that hard for me to be saying, Lord, be with Sarah today. God, deliver their marriage. God, bring freedom today. Lord, we need a miracle. I can do that while I'm driving under my breath. Intercession doesn't have to mean like you retreat to a closet of your house like we saw that movie War Room. That's intercessory prayer goals, and we should have moments like that. But I'm pretty sure that intercessory prayer is meant to function in the everyday, in the small moments. God wants us to be offering those, to lift up the power of God over those situations. We all have time to intercede. And then there are those of us who don't ask for prayer because deep down there's just this little reservation that doesn't believe that prayer actually changes anything. Have you been there before? I've had my own doubts, if I'm honest, about will prayer actually make a difference in this thing? Or it seems like, okay, this is a really hard thing facing me, but I think I know how to figure it out. If I just do this, I call this person, we arrange this plan, we do this, and we just go right on down to the battlefield. And we forget to take the position of Moses or have someone take the position of Moses on our behalf and engage in the battle spiritually because we think, is prayer really going to make a difference? Well, I want to show you an example of intercession on behalf of God. This is a radical example, and sorry I'm stealing the thunder of whoever's going to preach Exodus 32 here in a couple of weeks. But there is this scene. It's going to happen in a couple chapters from now where the Israelites make an idol out of a golden calf. I know, it sounds a little bizarre, but they start worshiping and bowing down to this golden calf. Obviously, that infuriates Yahweh. They are to worship him and him alone, not some little golden calf that they make as an idol. So Moses hears from God. God tells Moses, I'm going to let my anger burn until it consumes and kills all the Israelites. Like that was the last straw. They are done. But Moses refuses to back down from interceding on Israel's behalf. He is adamant and he is defiant in his prayers. Look at how he pleads with God to change his mind. We'll put this up on the screens from Exodus 32. This is Moses speaking to God. He says, turn from your fierce anger, relent, and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember your servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, to whom you swore by your own self. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give your descendants all this land I promised them, and it will be their inheritance forever. Moses is like, God, remember when you said this? Then the Lord relented and did not bring on his people the disaster that he had threatened. That is a powerful passage. Prayer is mysterious. It's not like we engage trying to convince God to change his mind or to manipulate anything. It's not like a vending machine where we get the outcome that we are hoping for every single time. Prayer doesn't give us what we want necessarily, but prayer does give us God's will. Moses' prayers of intercession, time and time again on behalf of Israel, are just like the prayers of the nation of England on behalf of their troops at Dunkirk. They literally changed the course of history. Prayer has power. I want to share a real life example of intercession with you. If you know a bit of my story, my dad divorced my mom rather suddenly in 2012. Hold on, we won't show my diary just yet. There we go, thanks, Angela. It was a sudden and very painful season for my family. In the years that followed, we began to pray for 2 things. One was that God would bring a buyer for the dance studio, the business that my mom had owned and ran with my dad for years in Indiana, so that she could move full-time to California, get work out here, and live with me and my sister. She had been going back and forth. So we are praying for a buyer, and we are also praying that in God's timing, he would bring my mom a godly husband. A few years go by, and my mom has a serious buyer interested in buying her dance studio. And they had spent months talking and looking at negotiations and the business value and all of that stuff. And it looked really promising until one day he decides to back out. We are back at square one with no leads, defeated. It was a season marked by hopelessness. She was also as single as could be. As single as I was in my 20s, until God brought me Mark. Anyway, that was a side note. There was no traction, nothing, no dates. My mom was like, I'm not going to pursue anything. I'm not going on online dating. Like, I believe that God will bring me a spouse if he wants me to be remarried. So, out of this hopelessness, I wrote this prayer in my journal on behalf of my mom. And we can put this up. I just want to show you, this is what intercession can look like. It can be writing your prayers. This is me asking God to specifically bring my mom a buyer of the dance studio and prepare her and bring her a godly husband. And I didn't even realize it until I read this the other day. At the very bottom, I write, sustain her and carry her into the promised land, which I thought was just so fitting when we align our spiritual journeys into our pursuit of the promised land. But this is just an honest, real-life example of intercessory prayer. And now I know what you're thinking. Wow, what a good daughter she is. I know. I know. I was proud of little Rachel. No, I'm just kidding. That's not the point of this passage. The point of me sharing this example is to show you what happened afterwards. Nothing immediately happened. Nothing immediately happened. Months went by. About 4 months later, my mom meets someone on her flight home from California to Indiana. It's a guy she dates for a year or so, but I knew right away it was not the one for her. It took her a little bit to figure that out. She got out of that relationship, which was again back to a point of feeling like we were at square one. But you know what that relationship did? That season, God was preparing her and preparing her heart for what he was going to do next, which was to reconnect her with her high school friend, Rocky. And next month, they're going to celebrate 5 years of marriage together. God ended up bringing her a buyer for the dance studio too, and her studio sale ended up being way better and way smoother than it was with that first prospective buyer. It almost seemed, I remember in the midst of it, like we said to each other, wow, this seems too good to be true. But you know what? There is no too good to be true when it's God. And what's really cool is that journal, all of my journals really, have become a collection of memorials, ways that I can turn back and see how God has answered prayer. I can look at desperate pleas for intercession, and I can see what God has done in my life. I don't like journaling. It makes my hand hurt, but I love it from the fact of a spiritual formation perspective. When I'm in those seasons doubting, is God really going to come through this time? I can flip a few pages back and remember, here are all the times where I faced something that I thought, God's not going to be able to come through. And yet he did, time and time again. So that's just a little side plug for journaling. If you want to write your prayers down, you have this memorial of what God has done in your life. Friends, we are all walking through a desert wilderness of some sort, and we are all faced with different battles. But I can guarantee that the person sitting next to you or in front of you or behind you is also facing a spiritual battle. You know, when we come to church isn't supposed to be just this 90-minute, emotional experience where you get to listen to some good music or maybe be inspired by a message and you're entertained or your mood is lifted and then you're out of here and you're on to the next thing. That's not what this is supposed to be at its core. The local church is like a little military outpost where we as God's children, his image bearers from a particular region, we gather right here from the Chino Valley every Sunday to come and to be refueled for the spiritual battle that we fight. To come here and to say to our brothers and sisters who sit next to us, would you lift my hands in this battle? Would you pray on my behalf? We come and get prayer when it's offered at the end of the service because we know that to win these battles that we face, we have got to employ our spiritual weapons of intercessory prayer. We want to be a church here that is known for interceding for one another, where we intercede for reconciliation and broken relationships. We intercede for the person who needs physical healing in their body. We intercede for the person who is without a job and needs one. We intercede for the table that needs food on it because things are tight this month. We intercede for the marriage that looks gone beyond repair. We intercede for the children who have gone far from God and the parents are begging for them to come home. We intercede for our brothers and sisters who've been hurt in unimaginable ways. And we say, God, please, somehow, in your mysterious way of turning all things for good, would you do that now? Would you do that now? So that's exactly what we're going to do this morning. We are going to intercede for one another. But before we do, let me conclude with this. We have seen week after week that the book of Exodus is a book that echoes into the rest of Scripture. Israel didn't defeat the Amalekites down on the battlefield. That battle was won on the hill. And it was a battle won through intercession. This passage foreshadows another hill where the ultimate battle against the real enemy of death will be won, on the hill at Calvary. Moses is an intercessor for the people of God, for the Israelites. He is the forerunner for Jesus as our ultimate intercessor. And just as Moses had his hand spread out to dispense judgment from that hill on to the enemy, Jesus spread out his hands to receive judgment, to receive the penalty of our sins. He went to the cross as the ultimate, most radical act of intercession in the history books. And that was to stand in the gap as our intercessor, the gap that had been created because of our sin and had left a space, a chasm between God and his people. Jesus filled that gap with his own life as sacrifice. And now Jesus sits at the right hand of the Father as our personal intercessor. That should give us such hope for whatever we're facing today, because just like the Israelites in the desert facing the Amalekites, just like the Allied forces in World War II at the battle at Dunkirk, what they were up against, their enemies seemed too powerful and too great until they realized and saw that the battle belonged to God all along. It wasn't won by their hands. It was won through intercessory prayer. So is true for the battles that we face today. They ultimately all belong to God. Our role is to lift our hands and declare God's power and will be done right here in each of our big and little circumstances, on earth as it is in heaven. So I'm going to invite the worship team back up now. And for a response time today, we are going to ask each of us, I want you to identify the one, just one, battle that you are faced with right now in your life. Now, I don't want you to think of the battle that your neighbor's fighting. I don't want you to think of the battle that your cousin's fighting in a different state. Those battles matter. But remember what I said earlier. If we don't engage prayer in the battles that we are fighting, we give the enemy an easy win right then and there. So I want you to think, what is the battle that I am up against right now? What seems impossible? And once you've identified that, you'll find that there are these little white cards. There's 2 of them in the seat back in front of you. If you're in the front row, it's underneath your chair. Go ahead and take one of these out, just one. Leave the other one for the 11 a.m. Otherwise, they'll have nobody to pray for them like I was with Louie. You can use that pen once you have your battle. I want you to write it legibly and clearly on this card. Clearly and legibly. You can keep it anonymous. Don't write your name on it. We're going to pass these around. Somebody else is going to be praying for your battle this week. So for now, take out that white card, take out the pen. Clearly and legibly write the battle that you are up against, that you want prayer for this week. And then as the worship team plays, leads us into response time with that first song, I want you to drop these cards into the white basket in front of your section. Now, this is going to be important. I realized this the other night. We have to do this way. Each section has to drop it in their own basket. Okay, so this section, you're going to come right here. This is your white basket. This section right here. This one right here, and this one right there. So once you have your card filled out, you've written your battle down, come and drop it into the basket, and then I'll come up in a bit. Go ahead.